Okay, hey everybody, welcome to the June 13th, 2018 session of the Chicagoland SharePoint Users Group. We've got all our normal interesting stuff, and we have one special kind of long presentation by me today about a solution design pattern for workflows and process automations. So let's get started. A lot of the attendees are now kind of in place and ready to go. Hope you guys are having a good summer so far. The agenda for today is talking about the big picture, per usual, news and events by me, Office 365 news and events update by Michael Blumenthal, SharePoint framework update from Ralph, and then we're going to dive into what will take the majority of today's session, a universal solution design pattern for SharePoint, basically everything kind of workflows. Lastly, as time permits, we'll have bring your own P, bring your own problems. And feel free to ask questions along the way. Help us understand, where you want to spend extra time during the session. Remember, we're moving from Meetup. We literally are gone off of Meetup now. You can only find us on LinkedIn. So if you go to LinkedIn and you go looking for the Chicago Area SharePoint Users Group, we've got a little over 30 people have managed to find us again. Some of them, in fact, are new, which is great. But we are now off of Meetup. So if you want to find out more, be sure and get into LinkedIn, find us there. Time for some more subliminal messages, the way that I used to present some of this big picture stuff in the past. There is no such thing as a killer app, a single killer app in SharePoint, but there are SharePoint killer practices, and that's what this group is all about, learning and understanding and disseminating and sharing those killer practices. A couple of big ideas to take away that are part of today's big picture is SharePoint should not be perceived as the pet of IT. If you've fallen into that trap, you need to take steps to try to get everybody to understand that SharePoint is actually not the pet of IT, but the workshop of the business. Another bit of subliminal messaging is embracing the horde. You've seen different ways of presenting this information, but if you can identify that dark rogue ninja hidden IT, the developers, the designers, even the power users in your organization, if you teach them, if you embrace them, then you will eventually, ultimately, effectively triple your entire development staff, and that works to everybody's benefit. You also want to work at trying to distribute your development. Push it down as far as you possibly can. Don't overburden the people that are up at the top. If someone in the developers group, even the rogue group, can do a job, task them with it. If the designers can do it, task them with it. If the power users can do it, task them with that. You want to try to distribute and delegate as much of this activity as possible so that it's appropriately assigned to people. That it frees up your architects and your IT staff to actually do the hard stuff, the stuff that they're supposed to be doing, the monk type of stuff. So keep that in mind going forward. Diving now into SharePoint news and events, here's the distillation of what's been going on in the month of May. The SharePoint Conference 2018 in Las Vegas, May 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, reports are it was fabulous. It was exciting. We had a couple of current stats showing up that everybody wants to know about SharePoint. There's currently 400,000 individual organizations across the planet that use SharePoint. Over 70% of all of those SharePoint user seats are now in Office 365. Microsoft's happy about that. Hey, we're happy about it. There are over 135 million active users in Office 365. That is a huge chunk of users of any particular kind of technology. Key items in SharePoint this year, list creation has been improved. Copy and pasting from Excel has returned and is now better than ever. SharePoint framework got some cool updates. We'll see Ralph's slides on that. Row formatting, actual color coding on a row-by-row basis, now available in SharePoint lists. The mobile application that's in everybody's phone is now improved. They've even incorporated image analysis, Red AI. You can now do image recognition. And if you put pictures inside picture libraries, you can subscribe to the AI cognitive features and actually do stuff. You can glean information out of nothing but an image. I'll let that sink in for you guys. You upload an image and SharePoint puts words on it for you. SharePoint discerns information about it that becomes text, and then you can process that image based on information that it gleaned out of the image itself. That is a marvelous, marvelous achievement. The admin center has been revamped. You can now do script running when joining a new SharePoint hub, and we'll probably include that in next month's session talking about the SharePoint Hub some more. Lastly, they're now introducing mixed reality into SharePoint. You're wearing goggles and you're collaborating. It was kind of a gas to see. Microsoft also released even more Microsoft Planner features. And one thing that I wanted to point out that I was really happy about, and I only just noticed, is that now even SharePoint on cloud now provides sync, what I'll call sync light, just the way OneDrive does. Michael Blumenthal told us this months ago. OneDrive was going to go through this great change where when you do synchronizing, an entire copy of every file does not have to exist on your laptop. That went into effect. The whole world rejoiced. It's fantastic. I literally stumbled about a week and a half ago on the fact that the SharePoint libraries now do that the exact same way. I'm not storing literally tens of gigabytes of files on my every single laptop. It's just the equivalent of a shortcut, and everything really stays up inside OneDrive, up inside SharePoint, up in the cloud. I couldn't be happier. May 30th happened today. That was actually held here in Chicago. I attended it. It was actually fantastic. There were about 40 people that showed up. It was a great put on by Infosys. So, kudos to those guys. Looking ahead, we've got digital workshop experience in Chicago, SharePoint Saturday, New York City, come on, stuff going on in August, and that really covers everything going on inside SharePoint land. Let's segue over to Michael Blumenthal to talk about Office 365 news and events. Mike, I'm changing presenter over to you. You have the ball.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. And I just want to follow up on something you said about the SharePoint and OneDrive sync features, where you're not syncing all the content, you're only syncing really placeholders. That's a feature called Files on Demand, and it actually came to OneDrive and SharePoint at the same time because it's actually a feature of Windows 10. But it's a feature starting with a specific build of Windows 10. It arrived in the what's called the 1709 or 2007 September build, and so you have, which also known as the Fall Creators Update. So you have to have at least that version of Windows 10 for you to see the Files on Demand capability, and then you have to turn it on in your OneDrive setting. And if someone's interested in that, I can talk more about that later or next time. Okay. But for today, I want to share my take on the on upcoming Office 365 events, and maybe a deeper dive into some of that Office 365 news that Mark covered. So in terms of upcoming events, as Mark mentioned, DWX, the Digital Workplace Experience Conference, is June 18th through 20th. From a SharePoint perspective, there's a couple of things important about that conference. So it's not a technical conference, it's more of a business-focused digital workplace conference. However, on Monday, the 18th, Rich Skloot, one of my fellow user group leaders from the Office 365 Adoption User Group that I also run, will be speaking, doing a lunch and learn there. And then on the 20th, Microsoft's Chris McNulty will be doing a 15-minute presentation on an Office 365 case study relating to NASCAR. So if you have a chance to go to that, definitely check out those things. I plan to be there the 19th and the 20th. Then, so that's this month. That conference, which is I call it polyglot or multi-language, not technology-specific software development conference for software developers, is in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin Dells, August 6th to 8th. It is one of the few conferences that has a family track. So that's worth checking out. That's at thatconference.com. Then in September, there is Microsoft Ignite. And that's going to be another key time for SharePoint and Office 365 announcements. And then SharePoint Fest comes back to Chicago in December for not 4, but 5 days this year.
Cool.
We recently had a Office 365 Adoption User Group meeting, and that was Caruana Gatimu, I misspelled her name there, G-A-T-I-M-U, from Microsoft in Redmond, did a presentation to us about adopting Microsoft Teams. If you're using Microsoft Teams in your organization or planning to, this thing's full of resources and advice and best practices. And that recording is going live on YouTube tomorrow. Sorry, not tomorrow, but Friday. So look for that. And then our next user group meeting is going to be August 2nd, where we talk about champion programs, very related to what Mark was talking about with getting business users to be champions for your technology initiative. So if you're interested in that, please sign up at our meetup site, and the link to that's there. It is case sensitive, and the details of that aren't listed yet. We're still working on the details of that meeting, but again, the topic we're currently planning on is champion programs.
Okay.
Moving on to some of the news that came out of the SharePoint Virtual Summit, also known as the keynote from the SharePoint North America Conference. As Mark said, there's SharePoint Spaces, which is this idea of having mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality environments that can publish to a SharePoint site. So the business application here, as you can see from the screenshot, is a way to really a new way to visualize your business data and explore your business data and really walk through your business data in ways that you haven't seen before or haven't been able to before. This is very early in the development of this. They are having limited preview programs coming soon, so don't expect this to hit a production pen at any time soon.
And Mike, inside this vision, can you go back one slide just really quick? Is the idea that the headgear itself is going to know where your eyes are focusing. So if you stare long enough on any one part of the page, it's going to start to navigate into it, isn't it? You're going to look at Miami really hard. Your eyes are focused there. It's going to literally start drilling into the details that you have on Miami or Chicago or New York. It's a way of using that mixed reality and understanding where your eyes are focused and using that to infer where it should be trying to show you information.
Yes, given what they've done with HoloLens, I would expect both gaze and gesture to be usable in these environments, depending on the capabilities of the headset.
Yeah, cool.
So there are a number of other improvements to Office 365, but in particular to lists that were announced. Mark mentioned briefly paste from Excel. So on-premise, this used to work if you were using the right browser, had all your columns aligned. It was a full moon, and you'd sacrifice the live chicken just at the right time.
Agreed. It has been like that since 2003, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And a lucky rabbit's paw.
Right, and so finally they're addressing this properly and they're creating have created and will soon roll out a new copy and paste experience where you're copying data from Excel into SharePoint, into a SharePoint list that will work on all the supported browsers. And not only that, it's going to be much more intelligent about what happens if, say, you're pasting in more columns than the list has. It will automatically create those columns for you and alert you to these things in a nice, pleasant UI. So I think that's really exciting for a lot of people because it makes bringing traditional tabular data that's often trapped in Excel into SharePoint, where you can really take some of the limits off. And again, make sure you're targeting the right use cases. If you have highly relational data in Excel, this won't necessarily be a great place for it. But if you have simple tabular data, there's a number of benefits to the SharePoint list, which probably most of us are familiar with. And then they talked about was real-time updates. So if you're looking at a SharePoint list and someone else is adding a row to that list, when they add that row, you'll see the row appear in your view without refreshing. So I'll be JavaScript working on the page behind the scenes. As Mark mentioned, there's improvements to Planner, and here they were showing off the ability to promote a list item to a Planner task. And as Mark mentioned, more row and column formatting options. So before you had the ability to format a column, now you can format a row. Between these two, you can create much richer user experiences around lists, such as color coding rows based on some column value in that row. So you can, for example, one of the things that they like showing off is you could use a flow to bring in tweets from Twitter tweets into a SharePoint list, and then as part of the flow, run those through artificially intelligent sentiment analysis, store the sentiment score in the list, and color code the rows showing which ones were positive, which ones were negative, and which ones were neutral.
Wow.
So yeah, so there's a lot of potential there, and a lot of features that are coming. The timelines, of course, are a bit loosey-goosey. Some of these things will arrive before Ignite, some will arrive by the end of the year. But which day anything will arrive in your specific tenant is still a matter of anyone's guess.
Yeah.
There were a lot of other announcements there, so I would highly recommend taking the time to watch the keynote. It's available on demand at the URL you see here, aka TVS SharePoint Virtual Summit. Case sensitive, I assume. And then finally, one of the other changes that was recently released is, or at least announced as coming soon to at least my tenant, and should be coming soon to all tenants, is the Message Center reader role. And again, exactly which day this will end on your tenant is anyone's guess, but something definitely to watch for if you have anything to do with change communications for your tenant. So the wonderful thing about Message Center reader role is that you can give non-admins read access to the Message Center. So if you have a governance team that consists of a mix of both IT people and, say, internal communication people or other people in the organization, and you want them to get the weekly digest of changes and be able to click through the links provided in that weekly digest, you can give those people the Message Center reader role, and that way they don't have any ability to change anything, but they can read the Message Center role and control their subscription to the digest. And so that's a great way for those key players to get directly receive the weekly newsletter of what changes are coming.
Cool.
So that's all the news I've got for this month. So I look forward to talking to you again next month. Thank you,
Mike.
And Mark.
Thanks again. I'm going to actually try switching on this side back to myself, showing my screen. Can someone confirm that you can see the slide deck again?
Yes, you're good.
All right, shift into the next one, SharePoint Framework, News and Events with Ralph Rivas. Ralph, feel free to talk for the first few seconds to your bullet points, and then tell me when you want me to make you presenter. Go ahead.
All right, get your finger on the button there, ready to go. Hello, folks. Okay, back for the SharePoint Framework, or rather the dev section of the meeting over here. Just a few things to cover. As usual, there is another blog for the SPFx updates, which I'll remind everyone about, or if you haven't seen it before, I'll show it to you. The big one, of course, is like we've got some stuff was covered last time about the conference, but these are the ones that are really for focusing on this time around. One is the new framework version with something called Plus Beta, and you'll see that shortly. Then, of course, there's a MS Graph. We keep talking about it. We keep teasing folks about it. But there's a lot of power in there, and I just want to bring that up and show you why it's important to look at it. Finally, just to add a little bit of flavor, a few code gems of things that have come out over the last month that are, for me, even they're new, and they were like, wow, we've been waiting for this for a while. They were always potentially doable, but until someone actually took the time to post it in the community, you don't see it. So go ahead and let's look what I'll show you a few things. And share the screen over here.
Ralph, I've just handed you the baton. Go ahead.
I'm showing my screen. I'm going to show monitor 2. And monitor 2, you should see some web pages.
4 pages tiled back or cascaded. Go ahead. Looks great.
Okay, so let's take a look. So this is, of course, the this is a page that everyone should have handy on them, which is the essentially the blogs page. So you can see essentially the updates. They call it the P&P now. It's called the pattern. P&P stands for Patterns and Practices. From this is where whence came essentially the SharePoint framework and everything else. So it's just, this is again the most important page that you could have as far as communications to change management. And this talks about things that have happened, things that are going on. From over here, you can join all the special interest groups. You can see essentially the entire dev ecosystem, and this GitHub pieces over here has grown actually, and somewhat. But like literally every example you want to do, you don't recreate the wheel. Come here first to figure out what's going on. It talks about the latest changes. So actually, here's one that's not on my list over here. It's the SharePoint Starter Kit, and the only it's a development thing, and it's not a development thing. If you think about it, using the development pattern, they created essentially the ultimate template that's got all the things that you need to be able to do all kinds of stuff you need to do in dev. Guess what? It works by itself without touching anything. All right. So I have a feeling in the future we should cover this by itself. Now this is the first version of it, so it's going to take a little while to get to the bits, which is why I didn't give it highlights. One of those like, I'm going to tease you with this. Go ahead and play if you want. But I think this should be a session to itself one day. All right.
Ralph, do you think that starter kit, does that apply to on-premise and up in the cloud? Or is it only
this is the cloud. This is the cloud. Only the cloud.
Yeah, got it.
SPFx is pretty much the cloud with some exceptions, all right? Until 2019, it's going to be pretty much that way.
Gotcha.
Same thing here. Framework examples. There's a bunch of things over here beyond what I'm going to show you in a little bit. And they go through a little bit of details. The Office CLI is getting to be the way of getting things done. You know, so put your PowerShell aside, get used to the CLI, remember get the love. Provisioning stuff, okay, you can go through these, you can go through it with you. Let's see if there's anything else here that I need to show you. No, pretty much the same thing. So let's go ahead and close that up. And let's take a look at now the SharePoint framework. So basically this one came in. It has it has new tools and a beta preview. So a couple of important things over here. And let's take a look at this one piece right over here. I wish I could remember how to zoom in fast with my zoomer, but I don't have it just yet. Check out the command now. So when you're building your framework, you put in a plus beta in there. And what does that give you? There are essentially the bleeding edge stuff that's in there, the things that are new, including the MS Graph and this thing here called dynamic data, which is extremely powerful, but we'll talk about that in a bit. You can have them on or off. Why would you say include in your framework? If you're doing production work, you should not really have beta stuff in there unless you really, really need it. But the concept is now you can essentially with the same framework, you have the option of loading it heavily or just loading it with just what you need. The concept of that is extremely important.
Yeah,
I'm going to talk about some of these pieces. Yep. Go ahead.
Just having the option is nice to know.
Yes. This is the option over here. So we'll take a look at some of these other ones over here, and this explains basically how some of these pieces work. Let's continue on. So let's go back to this graph thing. Here's the thing about graph. Guess what? They got a SIG now too. So here to developer.microsoft.com ENU-US and go to graph. And this is your starting point. Learn more and basically be part of everything. Essentially what they're doing with the PNP, they're doing with graph. And they're showing essentially now graph goes beyond just SharePoint. And maybe it's a good time to say that it's not about SharePoint anymore. This is Office 365, whether it's on-prem or anywhere else. Microsoft's vision of this is SharePoint is just the name of the one aspect of it all. All right, whatever you're doing, you always have to look at the whole enterprise in considerations. Why are you building subsites when you should be doing hubs, or you should be doing channels or anything else? The same thing with graph. Graph works through anything, works from everything, and you can create your own bits to make it work. All right.
And
so,
Ralph, if you had to try to describe it, even last year we had a demo on this, and we were saying that the graph in its current incarnation represents this kind of unified web service that lets you access everything you would want to access in Office 365. Active Directory, databases, I mean, anything about any person you can start accessing through graph. It's just got a goofy name. If they just said unified web service, everybody go, ah.
Well, there was a goofy guy brought to Congress because of all this data he allowed other people to go see in the millions, causing all kinds of problems. You remember that guy? Well, guess what? That guy, for all his goofiness, is doing what this is, really. The only difference between this is, here, look at, I click the Graph Explorer. I could make my own queries. Here's an example of what Graph can do. This is what I recommend all of you, including administrators, do. You want to see what you have available to the person with enough access. You want to know where your holes or leaks are, or know what's possible. Come here, play with this, and either be shocked, be amazed, or fall in love, whatever you want to do. Pick your feeling, but this is where you would find out all about it. And
just to be clear for everybody,
now asking me why I'm showing your stuff here, Mark.
Yeah, no, feel free. What Ralph's about to show you is that this is mostly a REST interface. You can query and consume the Graph API. Even we were showing this last year.
Last year we didn't have this. You see this? I can turn on categories that I want to see. Check this out. Really cool. I can say, this is all I want to see, and just say, okay, that's it. Show me that, and then this updates over here, and those samples will now come out. I click on something, or like this get, for example, and says, hey, look, check it out. I did that get, and look at this data that's coming through for this test user. Now they have a test user that's got stuff. I'm not going to sign. If I sign as myself, I'll see my stuff. Very cool. All right. Before I get too carried away over here, because I could get carried away with just Graph by itself. And finally, over here, a few little bits of gems over here. And this is the big one. We were talking about Angular. Angular said, we can do Angular? Well, yes, sort of. But the real thing is Angular elements. If you are bleeding edge and you really want to get this stuff down, and you are Angular, let's just say aficionados, you're an Angular shop, this is what you have to be familiar with. And finally, good old Waldeck posted for the first time the hello world for Angular elements. I mean, it's just hello world, but hey, Le Monde is where things leave. You come and other things. Oh, so here's a dynamic data example. You have to have the plus beta thing going for this. But what is dynamic data, you asked? Dynamic data is sort of like the web connector web part. Remember that? You had the two web parts that could talk to each other, but it's more, imagine being able to talk to any place on the page and connecting to it to wherever the page, wherever you're looking at on the page changes, whatever it is, that's dynamic data. So it's the web connector on steroids. And there's an example of how to play with it. Right now it's just React, but you know that's going to get more. And of course there's instructions on how to do it right over here. So it's very easy. And this one over here is the SharePoint Dev SPFx dynamic data. Oh, what a very simple link that's in here. But if you're really serious about your dev, this is what you get into. And believe it or not, that's all she wrote for this edition of SPFx.
Fantastic. Great timing again, Ralph. Thanks, you guys. Lots of exciting stuff in the SharePoint framework because, hey, that's where everything's going. In the meantime, there are lots of people that are actually working with previous versions of SharePoint, and this users group wants to be cognizant of that. So tell me when you guys can see my shared screen again. We're going to spend the remainder of today's session talking about a particular design pattern that was actually brought up at a previous session as a request. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. The rest of today's session is going to be talking about something called Possible and Intuitive, a design pattern for state machine workflows using SharePoint Designer. Let me close this really quick. I've got to launch a completely different slide presentation. And let me know when you guys can see that. This actually is a couple of years old. This is very tried and true. I've been using this pattern since at least 2007, maybe even 2003, since SharePoint Designer came out. You guys can see okay?
Mm-hmm.
Here's where I start talking fast because I do have a lot of information in the slides. I am going to gloss over some of the slides, but the slide deck is going to be made available to members for download later. So try to pick up on the highlights, try to pick up on the keys that I talk about in the next couple of minutes. This was taken from a previous presentation that I did for other SharePoint users groups. The big sneak peek is this. You're adopting a different way of approaching how you automate business processes using SharePoint Designer workflows. You are going to be adhering to a few tips that I give you, but mostly it's about thinking that the process is the process. The process is not a document, and the document is not a process. All too often, processes fall into this habit, this trap, if you will, of being considered part of a document. Nothing could be further from the truth. What you're really going to be doing is creating a common set of lists and workflows, little robots that are automating a single complex process, so that for various processes, there will be a process list devoted to that process, and every item in that list is an instance of that process. And with that process are going to go a set of related tasks specific to that process and no other processes. There may even be an initiating list or library that when something happens in that triggers an instance of a process. But the idea is that you have lots of little robots all tackling individual little pieces. This pattern has been around for quite a few years now, and it actually plays very, very well with Microsoft flows as well. So that even though you might be on SharePoint 2010 on-premise, 2013 on-premise, even 2016 on-premise, if you're using SharePoint Designer, this technique works whether you decide to make the switch up into SharePoint, into Microsoft Flows and SharePoint Online, or whether you remain on-premise. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. The big challenge we have is that most key business processes are complex. Typically, that means you're going to tackle them by creating something called a state machine workflow, SMWFs. The challenge is that SMWFs are hard, and what few design patterns exist that are SharePoint Designer based are arguably complex and very unintuitive. What can be done? There actually is a simpler approach. We look at some practical definitions of what a state machine workflow is. It's a set of event-driven and schedule-driven condition processing list workflows. It's a set of workflows, and some of those workflows are triggered by events, and some of those are triggered by schedules, and we're going to look at how we can actually make that happen using smaller pieces of SharePoint Designer workflows. Let's look. A couple other practical definitions to understand what it means by the state of a given process. It's usually not one variable. The overall state of one instance of a business process might be one master state. It's started, it's in progress, it's pending, and it's either completed and it's succeeded, or completed and it's failed. At the highest possible level, that might be the master state, but there may be individual substates somewhere along the line that approval number one, approval number two, decision number one, decision number two are all happening, and it's the values of all of those individual states taken as a set that actually represents the state of an instance of the process. And it's important to understand that once you start understanding that the process is its own entity and that it's not the document or documents that are somehow typically historically related to a project, a process, the easier this becomes. One mistake that people make is that they try to actually implement something I'll call business process automation. They try to actually automate the creation of a document or the opening of something. And what you're really looking for is this something that I'll call business process management automation. This is really telling people what they need to do. Ultimately, that ends up being what you really want to try to strive for. Why? Because it's always possible. It often manifests as several well-defined tasks and email messages that are going back and forth to people, even tasks in a task list that are being seen by people. And it's very completely achievable with SharePoint Designer and Microsoft Flow codeless workflows. That's why it's so popular. The reality is most organizations don't want to replace the people actually performing the tasks. They don't want to do that. This should not be a threat. What most organizations do want is the people performing the task but doing it better. And that happens through automating the management side of it. So you're not automating the actual work. It's just you're taking out the ambiguity and you're improving the efficiency of telling who needs to do what and when it needs to be done. It's that management part of it. Let's continue. Things that you'll need to actually pull this off are things that you already have in your SharePoint 2010 environment, your 2013 on-premise environment, etc. You need Microsoft SharePoint on-premise, that's OP, and SharePoint Designer, or if you're up in the cloud, SharePoint on cloud plus SharePoint Designer, or if you're even a little bit more advanced, SharePoint on cloud plus Microsoft Flow. You're going to be creating multiple Microsoft Flows. Microsoft Flows are just workflows done up in the cloud as opposed to using SharePoint Designer. And they can be very complex or they can be reusable smaller chunks, and we're going to lean towards the latter. Other constructs you're going to build inside SharePoint, you're going to build websites to act as containers for libraries and lists. You're going to end up defining content types, and this might be new for you, but this is a key element of understanding that a process can actually be its own content type, and therefore it has a set of properties. And those properties, like different statuses, different decisions, will have a set of values. And that set of values of all of those different properties for that instance of that content type is what represents the state of a given instance of a process. And that's where the magic actually happens. It's responding to any changes in that instance of that process, and the various values of the properties that it contains is all that we're trying to achieve. And suddenly all of the different processes in your organization start to take on a very common shape, a very uniform shape. They all look the same. Different values ultimately on different properties, but ultimately the shape is actually exactly the same. We're going to end up building lists and library alerts. We'll have email-enabled lists and libraries, and we'll start developing our little workflows as the last things. The privileges you need to pull this off: site collection administrator privileges, and sometimes central admin for making potentially some small mods. In other words, it's in the scope of anybody to be able to build this. Key point: modeling is actually vital to the success of business process automation and business process management automation. If you don't model, the quality of your process workflow is actually equal to the quality of the process model. So if your model sucks, your implementation is going to suck worse. It's going to be the magnification of how badly you modeled your workflow, your overall business process in the first place. So that's where you need to spend a lot of time. How are you going to model it? I want you to start thinking in terms of swim lane diagrams. Swim lane diagrams are just a way of modeling a process by breaking all of the different actors into their very own things called swim lanes, where their work, where the flow of a business process flows into their office, into their swim lane, so to speak, and comes back. And there's a very important distinction that I want you guys to notice here. I have users up here, even various departments can show up inside these swim lanes. An HR process goes from HR into accounting, from accounting into security, from security into IT, from IT back into HR. Those would all be the names of different swim lanes. What I also want you to pay attention to is this: the workflows themselves, if you treat them like robots, actually become players that actually own their very own swim lanes in the process diagrams. You have to start thinking about these workflows as if they're robots, as if they're participants in the business process. You're not trying to figure out that the process is all about humans and then the humans go and do something with the workflow. The workflows are the actors in the process. And then it becomes very straightforward to start moving all the flow in your business process through all of these different robots as opposed to people. And that's what streamlines the management of what's going on. So think, you have to diagram you have to model your process accurately and completely. You have to do it in swim lanes, and you want to start thinking about your workflows in terms of the actors. They're actually the actors in those workflows. They have their own swim lanes. The blueprint then, and you saw a sneak peek at the very beginning, is that typically in any of your business processes, it doesn't matter what business unit or what department it's in, there's going to be a processes list that's going to contain all of the instances of that business process, and we'll see why later. Then those instances may or may not trigger one or more tasks. You're going to have your own dedicated task list, and what started or created that process instance in the first place might simply be any list or library out in your universe where an event happened that triggered the creation or the initiation of a particular process. So that we go from modeling a very complex business process, oftentimes with all of these diamonds that represent conditions or decisions that have to be made. Sometimes not yes or no, not approved or rejected, but switch types. It could be choice A, choice B, choice C, or others, but it's still represented by a diamond here. Any one of these business processes, no matter how complex, can actually be represented using this three-list construct over and over and over again, so that all of your workflows take on a common pattern. That makes it easy for them to code, easy for them to share, easy for you to split up and work on in teams, and later on it makes it easy for a new person to come in and inherit an existing workflow because there's an expectation of how it's going to look. He or she is going to start looking for the processes list, the task list. He's going to be thinking, or she is going to be thinking in terms of those common building blocks. That's what I want you to get towards. This ends up giving you a powerful, duplicatable process automation approach or a blueprint. The workflows, key points to know about workflows, whether it's in Microsoft Flow or even it's in SharePoint Designer workflows. There's only 2 events that actually SharePoint is capable of reacting to. One is called the item created event, and one is called the item changed event. That's all that you have available to you, but oftentimes in a process, what you're trying to do is react to the change of the value of a single column in an item. But you're never going to have that level of granularity. You have to work for it. All you're getting from SharePoint is whether or not a new item was added to a list or whether a particular item, the entire record, the entire item was actually changed. And the best approach that I can offer you is this. Don't try to get fancy with the names on your workflows then. You're only going to have, for any given business process, 2 particular kinds of workflows. It's going to be named after the list, the processes list, and it's going to be the item created handler workflow, or it's going to be the item changed handler. It's one of the 2. And that gives you the benefit, that gives you the luxury of being able to put any kind of processing inside there without feeling constrained by the name. That the name of the workflow was supposed to be the approver workflow, or it's supposed to be the document moving workflow. You've actually constrained yourself that that workflow cannot do anything else, or at least not intuitively do anything else, because you've named it and constrained it along the way. If you simply say all you're doing is reacting to a created event or a changed event at the item level, then you end up with a very generic, very extendable, very expandable, very evolvable workflow because it's doing exactly what you're saying. It's simply handling the item changed event. That's the best naming convention I can offer you guys after 15 years of doing this, that you're going to follow a pattern. Let's see if I have it on another slide here. You're going to end up with the name of the list in uppercase, followed by a hyphen, followed by the event name, item created or item changed, followed by the word handler. Sometimes I use the word processor. Makes no difference to me. It's either one. But the idea is that it's always going to be one of those 2 workflows for any given process inside my entire business. So that when I look inside SharePoint Designer at a list of workflows, I'm going to start seeing a common set of list workflows here. An item, a processes item created and an item change one for the tasks for that particular process. And I start to see a very common naming convention that makes it easy for me to identify with the business process I'm working on, with the list specific to that business process, the processes list or the task list, and then which event that I'm trying to go and trigger on. And you suddenly start seeing a very uniform approach to how you're actually reacting to all of the changes going on in any one particular process. So let's see, we're in any one workflow, then what you're going to end up doing is detailing the new process instance. You're going to be applying some kind of conditions and deciding what to react to, what to take, and then you're going to start creating your very first task to say what needs to be done next as a result of this change. Some other things that you'll see inside here is just a list of, I'm using some if statements in an example workflow here, that this is the processes change handler list workflow, very self-describing but very generic. It doesn't overly constrain itself. So now I can go do all kinds of stuff inside here. I can go and update items in a table. I can send email messages out. I can delete records from a table. I can do anything I want because all I'm doing is reacting to an item changed event. It's that generic. This is just giving you guys some samples of what these actually look like. Here's an example of me sending out an alert via an email message. And it also sets up a nice structure that I want to share with you guys about SharePoint Designer workflows. And you can get close to this in Microsoft Flows. At the very beginning, you're going to try to use the names of the section titles as a way of actually telling yourself what it is that you're about to do. And there's going to be a very common set of, there's going to be a ramp up, some to-dos, creating your workflow variables, processing the changes that occurred in that particular item or the fact that it's a new item, and then you're going to do some kind of a wrap up or a ramp down. But you're going to start achieving a set of fixed blocks that every single one of your workflows has that same common shape. Just like inside any other structure of any other application, there are going to be places where you put your common files, your libraries, your various objects. There can be a common structure inside a SharePoint Designer workflow as well. And if you leverage the titles to actually explain what it is that you're doing, then you'll see that those titles will actually also show up in the status. In all of the status lists in your SharePoint list, those titles get picked off so that when you're looking at the list, it's telling you, I'm in the to-do section, I'm creating workflow variables, I'm processing actions, and I'm wrapping up. Or the very last session would be completed. And you get to see that status showing up simply by this clever use of the title bar on each of the sections inside a SharePoint Designer workflow. Continuing. Let's see, what am I trying to show here? We're trying to decide which process statuses to actually update. So what we know is that this item changed. It's up to us to go and look at all the individual statuses in the list, the individual columns, to decide if the status changed from what it was previously. And if it changed, then based on the new value, we're going to take different actions. And this becomes the common processing that you do. Go and find the status column in your instance of your workflow. You already have an idea of what you've stored the previous value, look at the new value, see if there's a change. If there's no change, that's not what caused the item changed event to occur. You move on to the next column, the next status column, and try to find where the change occurred. Once you identify where the change or changes occurred, then you have logic in your workflow to simply take action and push it along. What this is equivalent to in the real world is if somebody went on vacation in the middle of a process. They're working on a process, they went on vacation, and a sub-worker came in. They have no previous knowledge at all of where the current state of this particular instance of a business process is. They only have a set of sticky notes that were left behind by the previous person, a set of sticky notes that persist what the status is of all of the different status variables in that particular process. So they simply look at all those sticky notes in a very methodical way, and then they start taking action based on the value of the sticky notes. They go and they push this particular process along until their work is done at the end of the day, and they leave because they were only working for one day. Now a new sub comes in on the second day, and all they know about the status of this instance of this workflow, of this process, is the notes that have been left behind. So in those few notes that have been left behind tied to this process, they have to try to understand the overall state of the process, and then they take the logical next step or next steps, and then they're done. They leave some sticky notes behind saying what they did, and they walk away. What you end up with, everybody, is that you end up with a workflow that is guaranteed to execute to completion every time it runs. It never goes into a suspended state or a waiting state, because all it does is come in, look for the changes, methodically react to each of the changes in that instance of an item, and then leave notes behind about what it actually did, and it stops. There's no stuck, which means you end up with a solution here that is actually completely upgradable and migratable even to different versions of SharePoint, because there's no pending states. The state instead has actually been stored as a series of values in the columns themselves, not buried inside SharePoint or in the SharePoint Designer application or even in the SharePoint workflow engine. The state is actually stored in the list itself. Let's continue. A key core element of this is that you're going to define a process instance as a content type, where you start off with the original item inside SharePoint. You're going to go and spin off an ABC item for company ABC, and in company ABC item, there's going to be a process type of item, and that's where you're going to store all of these additional properties, so that now when you create a processes list, it's going to be made up of process items, and those process items for this particular process are going to have a set of properties. And now you have a very elegant way of managing these items. They're not just generic dumb items. They're a specific kind of item. They're an ABC item, and not just a specific ABC item. They're a process item, which means they have these unique properties and a unique set of values, like started, pending, completed, deferred, canceled. In other words, your lists get smarter. What you end up doing then is, the secret is that you're going to track the current and the previous values of some of these key variables, these key columns inside your SharePoint lists. How am I doing for time? 12:51. I've got 9 minutes. This is equivalent for anybody that is a developer to actually building what are called list item event receivers inside SharePoint in Visual Studio, because all a event receiver can do is tell you when something has been added and tell you when something's been changed. Even inside your C# code in Visual Studio, you still have to methodically plod through and try to find out where the column level changes occurred, because it's the column level changes that you need to actually react to push a process from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 to step 5 to the final end. What are we doing then? We're methodically detecting all of the column level change statuses. We're processing each changed value, and this ultimately is the key to being a state machine. What I want you guys to pay attention to is that I said we're detecting all column level changes to the statuses, which means with this approach, there can actually be multiple changes to the process record, to that instance. So you can change multiple statuses all at the same time, and this approach can actually handle all of the changes. It's not that you have to make one change, process it, make another change, react to it, make another change, react to that. You can make all 3 changes at once, and this particular design pattern allows you to actually process all 3 changes at once and be done with your workflow, leave the workflow process in a finalized state so that the next activity can actually occur to it, which makes it very extensible and very stable. Let's see, what did I want to say here? Comparing current to previous status to detect where item changes is what you find yourself doing. This is what the code actually looks like, is that for every one of your status columns inside your SharePoint list, your processes list, you're going to have a corresponding column that says, it's just a simple text column that says, here's what the previous value was. So that as you go looking for at each of those status values, you can go and compare the current value that you're looking at to the previous status value. And if you see a difference, you'll know that's where a change occurred, and you can begin to use that as a starting point for your logic. That if the status is not equal to approval previous status, you know there's a change. And then you can start saying, if the change is equal to queued, if it's equal to active, it's equal to completed, go and take these various actions. And suddenly the logic in your workflow starts to take on a very uniform, very familiar, very intuitive, very duplicatable pattern, a very common pattern that you expect to see in all of your workflows. Hey, they're all just values, they're all just choices, you're reacting to different choices. And suddenly all of the workflows, no matter who's coding them, take on a very common uniform approach. Ultimately, business process administration and business process automation and business process management automation is all about handling those changing conditions. The actual process is just composed of logic. The rules are just another term for conditions. The logic then is simply methodically applying all of those conditions, just looking. Your workflow is just simply looking for where the changes are, finding the changes, and then based on what the new value is of the change, you're going to take various kinds of actions. And that is the part that I was telling you just moments ago, is the part that methodically is repeated and becomes something other than spaghetti code. It becomes inheritable by anyone else in your company that's going to tackle working on these workflows. Ultimately, you end up with 2 kinds of workflows that you have to try to manage then. The key to process automation is figuring out how to get both of these out of SharePoint. One of those is called event-triggered condition handling. That's easy. That's the one that has to do with changes happening, an add or a change in a SharePoint list. But the scheduled triggering one, nothing actually happened. I just got to go look on a regular basis. That's a little trickier, and we have a very elegant solution. Let's dive in a little bit more. Event-based condition handling. This is actually the most common. It's all about the item created event and the item changed event. So we simply have to react to those with our workflows and build some workflows around them that are specific to item created, specific to item changed, and we're rocking. You've been seeing that for the last 10 minutes. Let's look at the trickier one. What if we have a workflow that needs to execute even when an event hasn't yet occurred? It hasn't been created, it hasn't been changed, but I need something to happen simply on a scheduled basis. There's actually a trick that's works very well since SharePoint 2003. Scheduled-based condition processing is this one. A certain number of days has gone by. Nothing in your process item has actually changed. Just time has gone by. You can actually build, there's an existing nightly timer job that you can go and leverage in any SharePoint list or library, that you can tell it that every day at a particular time, I want to actually go and execute a particular workflow. So you're not creating a scheduled timer job. It already exists on every SharePoint list in every SharePoint library. So we simply have to take advantage of that on the task list and on the processes list to go and configure that there's going to be a new event that I monitor. The event is the ticking of midnight, that it's 12:01 a.m. the next day. That's my event. This timer job kicks off. It starts a workflow, and the workflow is actually going and running your little processing unit as if a change had occurred. So that between the two, the event triggered workflows that you've already been familiar with, item created, item changed workflows, we now have a scheduled trigger workflow. Basically, the sky's the limit on what we can actually accomplish. 12:57, I'm in the home stretch. One thing that you get out of this is the ability to see all of the status in your processes list. The processes list actually becomes a dashboard that you can color code all of the different statuses all along the way in your particular process, and at a glance be able to say, oh, this one's already done, this one's only done part way, and all of these are light blue, they're in processing. You end up with the ability to create a dashboard effortlessly because the processes list with all of its statuses and with its overall condition and with its master status is, by its very nature, a dashboard. You simply have to add some jQuery on there to color code it, and you're rocking. What's that color coding actually look like? It's just a little bit of jQuery that says, if you find this particular cell, and if the value inside that cell says green, then go and add the color background green to it. And the list goes on. It's a very simple little text file that I can share with all of you guys. You can color code things any way you want. So you can have color coding on the condition of any one process. It can be green, yellow, orange, red, but you can have different levels of color coding on all of the statuses too that give you an idea of where they're at in that life cycle. If it's light blue, it means it's untouched. If it's gray, it's untouched. If it's blue, it's being processed. If it's dark blue, it's been approved. If it's red, it's been rejected. And at a glance, you'll be able to actually see a dashboard like this and tell exactly where every given instance of a process is and what its current status is using color coding instead of actual values. Let's try to wrap up. What we end up with is dividing and conquering. We take a very large swim lane diagram and we assign pieces of it to individual robots that are actually going to handle their own little pieces. We ultimately end up with a three major components, the processes list. We end up with some kind of ancillary documents and a task list and an ancillary documents list that might contain documents related to the workflow, but it's not the workflow. It's not the process itself. And you end up with a lot of little robots. It looks scary, but this sets the stage for whether or not you have event-driven workflows and schedule-driven workflows, which sets the stage that you could even evolve into Microsoft flows up on the cloud. Big summary on the keys. We got 1 minute left. Use multiple lists. It's going to be a request list, a processes list, and a task list for each of the processes, ABC. Use lots of smaller workflows, standardize those workflows. Naming of the list, naming of the item that you're handling, and the fact that it's an item created handler or it's an item changed handler. You're going to section off all your workflow operations into steps. The startup step, the create workflow variable step, the processing of the actual conditions, that core step, debugging, wrapping up, including or expecting placeholder sections for future use. In other words, use it like commenting, and it becomes a very useful tool in SharePoint Designer. The result? All your workflows start to take on a common familiar structure. Remember, the document is not the process. The process is the process. That process has to be its own content type, and once you start doing that, everything will start falling into place, and your workflows, your overall business processes will actually start to become very manageable, and you'll be able to take control of it again. I don't think we have time for any discussion. I'll leave that on the slides there, and that is about it on that slide. Let's go and jump back into the last section of the deck here. We didn't get to BYOP. That's natural. Happens all the time. Next session, there's some more Power App stuff that we're going to bring to the table and talk about Microsoft Flows and SharePoint. Super powerful. We're going to show how those dovetail together. I'll start doing some demonstrations like I promised last month about Azure AI tools in SharePoint, that image recognition as a web service. And if anybody can think of anything else, fantastic. That's it for today's session. See you all on July 11th. If you have vacation in between, best of vacations to you. Thanks for coming today, and we'll see you in middle of July, all right?